Welcome, everyone, to Dolls of Our Lives. This is the podcast where we're reliving the American Girl series book by book, except here on Patreon, where we're tackling all kinds of interests in the world of the show. I'm Mary.
I'm Allison.
And on this episode, we're going to get into Danyel Smith's recent book, Shine Bright, A Very Personal History of Black Women in Pop. But first, Allison, what's new? What's exciting?
Besides, getting into the world of Melody Ellison and getting to read this book, let's see, been, doing my obligatory Taylor Swift concert watch on TikTok every weekend.
Very
nice. We'll be saying that for 6 months. It's like for a while we had Maddie in the mix. We had Ice Spice in the mix. Now it's like we're on a little bit of a break. She was just in Detroit, just like Melody. So we're all kind of like coming down from that. There will be a weekend where I open my phone and it's not people at this concert, but it's not this week.
That's fair. And we haven't talked about Taylor Swift's recent, like the Maddie of it all, the breakup. Like, do you have thoughts on that? Like her career, like the impact on the Maddie of it all, like any of it? Ice Spice?
To me, Maddie Healy, it's like someone said she's dating a brontosaurus. Like I had to have a young person like explain what he was to me. I did not know. I had to read articles to kind of get caught up. I do know that he is a Manchester man, so he is not a London boy. I'm aware of like that reality. That was kind of it. So I've like done a little bit of research because I wanted to understand the controversy. I do think that eventually we will get the definitive timeline of when Joe was out, Maddie was in, and when Maddie was out. But I think that right now we're being like deliberately misled.
I think to me that's the most interesting piece of this entire thing is what it has revealed of her, like the reach of her PR infrastructure. And I think if there's any net negative results of this for her career-wise, it's that she showed us too much of what she's willing to do behind the scenes to manipulate public opinion to approve of a thing she personally wants. So I think she personally wanted to be with him for better or for worse. And like Tree, her PR person, was working overtime to make that happen, like doing Ice Spice like features on the Karma remix because he said some really disgusting stuff about her on a podcast. And, just like the Gia Tolentino, like we read that book that she wrote about the internet and like digital culture. And she did this profile on him in the New Yorker, which I think was really trying to like recover him as like a misunderstood public intellectual. And really, it's like, I don't think it landed that way. So I wonder, like, does she lose something by showing us a little bit of too much of how hard she was working there?
I don't know. I think, someone who is brought up in this book that we read for this episode is Beyonce, like very much at the end, right? Like Beyonce is not a main character in this book, but she's someone who comes at the very end. And there have been periods in her like mega fandom, like in her mega superstardom, where she has decided that she wants us to see a lot, right? Like when she decided to do a quiet documentary about carrying Blue Ivy. We got a lot of access and then that kind of went away, right? Like she's kind of chosen when she really wants us to see inside her relationships and when she doesn't, and relationships with her sister and other people in her life. I think part of what is fascinating is just like the extent to which I can't, as a person who is not super up on music, avoid these stories, right? Like I did not know Ice Spice either. And then it was like, now I know that Ice Spice is the person who says facts on the Karma remix. Like you cannot avoid like these certain things, like these certain touchstones. And there are times where you have to catch yourself up to try to understand where everyone is coming from. I think one of the things about Taylor Swift is like she is very good at making you feel inside, and then these revelations show the extent to which you were never really privy, right?
Yeah.
Like she is perpetually in that maintenance cart in reality. Like the maintenance cart.
That's true.
Like she is her own Trojan horse. Like she is the horse. She's inside the horse at the same time. Like she is always like the world is her maintenance cart in a way. Like you think you understand, you don't actually understand. And pop stars now have a very different relationship with us than even when we were younger, right? Like talking to Aisha Harris about the Spice Girls, and the Spice Girls put out like in the equivalent of a spice rack, like you can be one of these things and you can try to fit into one of these things.
Right.
And now we live in the world of Ice Spice, who's like, I reject that and I'm my own character.
Yeah. And also seems like very earnest about not having to stand stuff for appearances. Like she just did a recent appearance at the governor's ball and was wearing a Knicks jacket. And she was like, LOL, I have no idea what the Knicks are. Like, I just picked this for the vibe. And that seemed like a brave moment. But, you know, I mean, I kind of am getting nostalgic for the big stars who were like, coming up when we were younger. Like, I was just at work today for some reason talking about when Lady Gaga just for no reason showed up at the VMAs as Joe Calderone and like invented a character and was like, I'm going to be in drag today.
Hey! My name is Joe Calderone.
Why? Like, where are people like taking those risks seemingly for no reason? Like, it just seems like people are working too hard to project this vision of themselves that no one can object to, that's also like a seemingly huge remove from who they really are. And I miss like that energy of like someone just being like, I'm a total weirdo, like here it is. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if like Taylor Swift's capable of that, but
I don't think I'll ever forgive her for the fact that she like made us all fall in love with the 4th of July and then gave up on it. Here's the thing, like, liberate yourself from Great Britain first. Like, you first, Taylor Swift.
Are you upset about that being because as a Rhode Island like spokesperson, her celebration, she was celebrating it in Rhode Island?
She got the whole world to like put their eyes on us at a very particular time of the year that is acutely important. Right. So Rhode Island did start the American Revolution with the burning of the Gaspee.
Oh, wow.
Many years prior to the Tea Party incident in Boston, which I'll put in air quotes.
You put that in scare quotes.
So, like, we are the origin, right? Like, for better or for worse. Like, that was basically a revolt by slaveholders about taxes. Like, that is what our country is. And Taylor Swift said, like, I'll bravely host a party that gets everyone really excited about the former colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. And then she ripped that away from me and really said, like, I'm only going to date English men of a certain profile.
That does seem to be where she's pivoted to. So it will be interesting to see, like, what's the next, you know, boyfriend.
Like, you next. Like, where's the Declaration of Independence for you?
Wow. Well, speaking of taking a tour, we weren't, but you have taken in a documentary that I still am trying to find time to watch because I think I need to see it all in one sitting, but I think it's like 4 hours or something. Like, tell me about the Duggar documentary.
So Shiny Happy People is on Amazon Prime, and it's definitely well worth a watch. I think if you're in a process of deconstruction, it's something that you'd want to read about first before diving in. I don't think it's for everyone. It's not a casual watch for anyone, but I think it's something to give some thought, you know, when you're engaging with it. They use the Duggars as an entry point into understanding the cult that their parents were a spokesperson for and continue to be a spokesperson for. And you learn, for example, that through this cult, instead of learning math in the way that some people might understand it, they learn like why you shouldn't see a woman's shoulders. And I think what people will take out of it is, I, like a lot of other people, like I'm still waiting for like the true definitive story of like why TLC made us care about multiple births. Like I still don't know exactly why TLC said like, you need to care about every person who's ever had quadruplets and up. Like, you need to watch it. You need to be part of it. They do a very good job of showing like the control that the patriarch Jim Bob Duggar has over that family. And it was really alarming to learn, among other things, that Jill Duggar worked as an adult for years and years for TLC and did not see a dime. And a concession her father gave her was he would pay her and her husband $10 an hour to continue to be on the show. And she astutely makes the point that they had figured out that they were the only thing that TLC wanted at a point, because she and her sister, Jessa, were the only adults that were like really still pulling in numbers. So it's very telling. I think it's like an important documentary about, you know, extremism in the country, but definitely not a light watch. Like, I think you kind of have to go into it knowing a bit about, you know, why these people were made to be so famous. I wish someone from TLC was in it to explain how they understood what they were doing.
Like what they thought they were making a show about as opposed to what ended up happening.
Or to hear, right, for sure, like you made a show about people who are part of an extremist cult. Was that on purpose, or did that get revealed to you, but you kept it anyway because the numbers were really good? Right. You really are not sure of that. What you are sure of is that entire family signed a lump contract with TLC, and Jim Bob always controlled all the money.
That's scary. And didn't they sue? Didn't what's her name and her husband sue for money that they should have earned making the show or something like that?
So part of what's revealed in the documentary is the fact that there's like different deals at different times, but Jim Bob recognized at a certain point that they had hit a crisis point in the family, and he offered all of the children lump sums, but they had to sign a contract to get that lump sum that they would continue to sign any other contract that was put in front of the family. And Jill pretty much singularly decided not to do that when it first happened. Now, I'm assuming there's other kids who have been able to distance themselves, but it's notable that the women who married men who had their own career trajectories prior to Jim Bob, they have all left, and the ones who were not lucky enough to do that are still in.
That's bleak.
Bad contracts, does that remind you of Motown?
It could. I mean, depending on who you were in Motown, but yeah, for probably a lot of acts, unless you're Diana Ross, I think she did okay.
True.
But yeah, we'll have to get in. We will get into this book, but I was just going to say what you're describing reminds me of, like, it seems there's a court case, I think, in Washington or somewhere about, like, children of influencers who are now old enough to object, who are basically like, we should pass laws to keep parents from being able to, like, put their kids on reality TV or, you know, post about them on Instagram as influencers or, like, you use them to get sponsorship money. It's, like, interesting that we've lived long enough to see this turn.
I mean, it's definitely child labor. It's not usually framed that way, but
Absolutely.
it's definitely children working. And I think that there has to be a very different definition of consent. And I've seen certain prominent influencers who have children who never show their children, who say, I can't have a conversation where I could possibly explain what I really mean about the reach of my influence and have my child consent in a meaningful way, right? Like that,
exactly.
There's a scale of understanding that they're not able to engage at because they don't understand millions of people.
Right.
I think that's kind of like good leadership on that front. But if you saw the trend where people held up their baby's like cute little feet to their head and they pretended like the baby was answering like a body telephone, like the amount of shares on those videos was really disturbing. And people were saying, like, not everyone who is engaging with your beautiful child has good intentions, unfortunately. And I think about like how vulnerable some of the Duggars have been forced to be on television. A lot of people didn't have good intentions, you know, revealing what the eldest brother had done to other people in that family, you know, ultimately was their undoing, but it also was not fair to people who are survivors of that person. You know, it's very, very complicated.
Yeah, it's so sad. But yeah, it seems like an interesting documentary. I'll have to get into that hopefully soon. I tried to watch a documentary in Down to Summer that just came out, but I found it to be unwatchable because it just had no... I couldn't get into it. It was like, I think the family did it, and I always find that to be challenging because it was super edited, and I wanted a chronological story of her life, and instead it was like, she had a video camera, she loved to make home movies, and it seemed like that's kind of what they had to go on. I don't know. I mean, we can get into it, and like, speaking of, we're going to talk about a book about how people have and have not told the stories of Black women in music. So, Allison, what did you make of Danyel Smith's Shine Bright?
So I will start by saying that I read this book in the way that I typically read, and then I listened to a sample of the author reading the book, and I realized that I read it wrong because I like books that I can kind of gut. I like thrillers. I like fast-paced contemporary fiction, whether that's like of a romantic hue, you know, or YA that I can kind of just like dig in and devour. And this is a kind of writing that requires like slow, careful appreciation, much like music. And that is not how I read. And I used to always say that I hated Jack Kerouac's writing because I was reading it the way that I like to read. And then someone told me that you have to listen to Kerouac. And I'm not a reader who like reads things aloud to myself in my head. That's just not how I read. Once I went back and I reread portions of this book, imagining it as a kind of song, I was fine. But I had a hard time comprehending this book, reading the way that I typically read. Then I heard her voice reading it and I said, oh, you're supposed to appreciate this as lyrical and slowly and not the way that I read. Just a bad review. Not that it is a bad book, but like that is like the way that I experienced this book, which I think like other people would experience it differently.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. I think it's worth saying, like, I was reading after the fact that her editor suggested originally she sold this book as a history of Black women in pop music. So she's going to profile like Mariah Carey, Aretha, Whitney, and she does, and we'll get into that. And then her editor basically said, you should go back and sort of write your own memories of interactions with these people as a listener, like a lifelong music listener, and then as a journalist, because she is really herself a pioneer in music journalism. She wrote a ton of really well-regarded profiles of women in music and then becomes the first Black woman editor of a music magazine. She was a music editor at Billboard, at Vibe, has worked at the New York Times, has worked a lot of different places, and came up through San Francisco working for Ann Powers, who's a very like famous music journalist at NPR, focusing on like putting women back into the story, so to speak. So she has this like really huge network and pedigree and has all these personal experiences, even with a lot of the people she ends up writing about. So it's kind of like two parallel stories, like her story with music and with these women in music who mean a lot to her, and then the story of those women themselves. So she'll kind of start talking about an artist and then it like reminds her of one of her own experiences listening to them, or vice versa. So it kind of reads like sort of meditative, or I really think it reads conversational. Like I imagine if you're listening to her read it, it makes sense, because it's like, this is how you would have a conversation with someone where they're like talking about something and are like, oh wait, that reminds me of like this other thing. And then they kind of come back to it. It's like, that's kind of how I imagined it reading it. And then I listened to her on Questlove's video podcast talking about her career, and it felt like reading the book. Like she does that in person with the people on that show.
I think there is a certain amount of knowledge that might be assumed in that conversation that I don't have, right? Like that makes a lot of sense to me, that it feels very conversational. I want to read what the book is billed as and then kind of give you like the publisher snapshot of her biography, because I think that perfectly sums up like what this book promises, and then like why the person who wrote it really does like shine through what you receive as a reader. American pop music is arguably this country's greatest cultural contribution to the world, and its singular voice and virtuosity were created by a shining thread of Black women geniuses stretching back to the country's founding. This is their surprising, heartbreaking, soaring story from, quote, one of the generation's greatest, most insightful, most nuanced writers in pop culture. And that last part is a quote from Shea Serrano. Danyel Smith's background, as you say, is incredibly impressive. Like she's created a lot of things. She's been a journalism fellow at Stanford. She's also written for Teen Vogue, New York Times. She's written novels, like pretty much everything you can imagine. And I do think that this kind of got molded or fashioned into like, this needs to be your love letter about pop, right? Like about like how you envision Black women creating the modern pop that most of us appreciate today. And I was really lured into the book. I loved the way that she started the book with a section on Phyllis Wheatley Peters and arguing that she is this singularly important voice in American pop as a Black female poet who read and performed and sang the lines that she wrote. I thought that was a brilliant way to kind of disorient people, because I expected Diana Ross, or I expected, a vignette about Janet Jackson, and those happen. But that was probably my favorite part of the book, because I never would have thought of that. That's never been a way that I've thought about the origins of pop music. And she sold me completely. I was like, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. That's really smart.
Yeah, that was surprising too, that she kind of established that genealogy that far back. But I think it really worked for her and for the book, because it kind of creates this like full circle moment when you start with someone who was totally discarded, or people with Phyllis Wheatley's poetry were in her lifetime saying, well, the people who are claiming ownership over you wrote the poems, and they're kind of propping you up as, you know, for their own purposes. Like Thomas Jefferson thought she didn't write those poems, and they're trying to like put them before George Washington and all these different things. And like basically everyone in her world initially is kind of discrediting her because she's a Black woman. Like, you can't possibly have written these poems. And then the book ends with a chapter on Mariah Carey, which obviously I'm into. And she makes a really great point, which is Mariah Carey has been derided for her songwriting. No one could believe that this woman wrote basically all of her own songs, but for the covers that she performed. And she ends up having 19 number one hits, which is only surpassed by the Beatles. And she's basically, I think her bigger point is people have disrespected Black women in music and how integral they've been to rock and roll broadly, like, or if that's the umbrella term for a lot of genres. And the book is really her saying, like, you discredit Black women at your own peril, and me at your own peril. Like, I think she says, like, I didn't put myself in this story at first. Her editor encouraged her to, because it's kind of like those two projects are linked. Like, the reason why Black women have not been in the history of rock and roll or rap or hip hop or R&B is because most of the writing is by men and white men. But she also, you know, I mean, so I think that is like an interesting point.
It's also where you understand the title of the book, right? Because she interweaves words from Phyllis Wheatley Peters in this introduction, and she also has other songs that are included in here. I think something that I really appreciate about this, and we also read the kind of modern retelling of her story, right, when we read the book about Phyllis. And so I liked that this kind of like set, as you say, the stage for the rest of it. How must it have been for her, our first star, as she tried and tried again to let shine her unbound light? Phyllis died alone, but not in vain. She is tied to me and makes herself mine to imagine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. And you get to the end and she talks about how, you know, Beyonce is this kind of like once in a generation talent, right? Like, there are all of these people who have really like been able to shine brightly, but she draws a line, as you said, between like this very early person who's striving all the way to the end with the final interview she conducts for the book, where there's this talk about like restlessness, like never really fully being able to be seen as the successful person that you ought to be, like to get that level of respect. This book made me think a lot about pop as a genre, and something that I kind of was like struggling with as I was reading through it is I didn't feel like I always understood like how this was in conversation with other genres, right? Like with the rise of hip hop or R&B, or even you say like rock and roll. Like, I think that was something I thought about a lot, because this is framed as pop in a very specific sense. But I think there's a lot to be said for looking across those genres back maybe 60 or 80 years. And I wasn't always sure how that connected, but that might be me not knowing enough about the subject.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, what did you think about the chapter on Aretha and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Because that, I think, kind of was trying to make, I think across the book, she tries to make some connections, but I think the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame chapter was her strongest attempt at sort of saying, like, from the very beginning, like, Black women were erased, not only from, within the history of rock and roll, but also within, like, the organization that was designed to remember the history of rock and roll. So it's created by an early rock executive, and he puts together this, like, dream team of people, including his former secretary, who becomes a vice president at this record label, named Noreen Woods. And she makes this point of, like, Noreen Woods was incredibly networked, brought a lot of people in to largely, like, white-owned record labels, and as a Black woman. And then, like, when she dies, like, her history is erased. Like, she was integral to founding the Hall of Fame. She does not appear on the website in the history of the Hall of Fame.
One of the first things you learn about Danyel Smith is that she's from a family that owns a record store.
Right. Yeah,
and she mentions in passing that, like, according to one source, or at least one source, it's the oldest in the area. And I liked the way that she phrased that, because it was like, this is very hard to peg, because there could be other people who did this that are simply not getting recognition. I think where I started to think about that was in the coverage of people in the disco era, right? Like, this book is divided basically into 3 parts. And the first part starts with like a very classic girl group called the Dixie Cups. And then it goes through several other artists, including Dionne Warwick, Diana Ross, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Donna Summer, right? Like pretty prominent people, The Wiz, other artists, and then Whitney and Aretha are like their own section. To me, like, it probably doesn't really matter exactly how we classify these things into genres. But I think for her, it's like pop is the super category and everything else falls under. Like, disco is a trend within pop. That's how I read it. And I maybe that's just me kind of taking on it. But I think she was interested in drawing that line of continuity, like across all these kinds of popular music. These are the people who are the most important change makers and artists of those eras. But pop is the through line that they all fall under.
To me, it was like each woman represents like some form of like how Black women are mistreated or like misunderstood in music. Like Donna Summer doesn't get respected because she works in disco, and like that genre is associated with Black people and queer culture and whatever, and all these things that get discounted within like pop probably, and all of those like moving like different eras, I guess, of music.
Had you heard of, like, was there anyone who was new to you in this book? Like, I knew the Dixie Cups' most famous song, Going to the Chapel. I don't think I could have told you the name of that artist. Like, I liked learning about people that I knew on some cellular level had this huge impact on pop, but actually learning their story was something I definitely appreciated.
Yeah, that was really cool. I mean, I kind of had heard of a lot of these people just because I'm a big music listening person. So, and I read a lot about the history of music or across different things. But what was really cool was like, she goes really deep on people. And so even if you read this book and you're like, yeah, I know about Donna Summer, I know about Aretha Franklin, like arguably the most famous female musician in 20th century, or like one of them, she's still pulling out stuff that you might not know. And Diana Ross is a great example of that. So like Diana Ross, I loved Diana Ross and the Supremes when I was growing up. Like I had their CD. I can still see them on the Music Central thing that was on my family computer, where you could watch like a 30-second clip of them. I was deeply invested. One year on my birthday, I went and saw Mary, one of the Supremes, who played in New Britain Park in Connecticut. And she was phenomenal. And Florence, like RIP, died in the 70s, I think. But, you know, so I really thought I had a handle on their whole history. And obviously there was this feeling that Diana like kind of kicked them all to the curb, or like manipulated the system at Motown to become the lead singer. She's involved in Berry Gordy, who founds Motown, and so on. So like I was familiar with that. I've seen her movies, etc. I didn't know about this whole thing about like her allegedly telling someone to call me Miss Ross at a certain point. And she kind of takes this on and is basically like, I want to use this as an example of thinking about why Black women are called divas and like what's going on with that, and kind of upends it. Because she even has like Oprah saying like, didn't you tell someone to call you Miss Ross? And Diana Ross is like, no, or like is like, yes, but in my culture, like that's a sign of respect. Like I always call someone Miss so-and-so or Mr. so-and-so. So she's trying to normalize it. But that, so like those kind of moments were interesting, where she's like, you think, you know, Diana Ross, like, let's like look at her from this other angle, or like use her to talk about this other thing.
Yeah, Danyel Smith starts that chapter by saying, like, I know you want me to talk about the Supremes, but I'm going to answer questions about the solo career of this person and focus really carefully. And in terms of just like thinking about how much it can cost to put a book together, there had to have been a team that majorly rallied behind this book, because the number of very cool photographs in this book and the amount of times, obviously it's a book about music, so you think, of course she's going to have lyrics and of course she's going to cite songs. That is really expensive, right? And that can like make or break a book, to actually like list out a bunch of lyrics from music. And it actually got me thinking about like the back end conversations that would have happened about this book. And the fact that when she lists out lyrics from the Dixie Cups, for example, or some of the less famous people in this book, part of what she's writing about is the process by which the people who wrote those songs got to be disenfranchised. Right. And so it's not like they are going to see the money, right, of what it costs to talk about this song, right, or like any kind of continued royalties or anything. I think she starts with that group because they put out such an amazing song that so many people have covered, like Bette Midler. I did listen to that cover. It's a rough listen.
Oh, really?
This is the first book I've ever read where I pulled up songs as she was writing about them so that I could hear what she was talking about. This gave me flashbacks so bad to the class I almost failed in college, which was Mozart and His World. Shout out to our musicology professors. I went to him and I said, I'm trying really hard and I'm literally failing. And he was like, I can see you're trying really hard. And yes, you are failing half of every quiz because you had to listen to music and identify movements and then answer history questions. So I got that half right and the second half completely wrong. He's like, I can see that you're trying. It's not successful.
You mean like it was like name that tune basically?
No, so we were learning about Mozart and His World in Vienna from two angles. We were learning about the historical context in which Mozart lived and why he became a success when others did not. And we were also expected to listen as part of our homework. And I learned I wasn't good at that part of it because I would listen, and I can play Mozart. But then going into a room where someone says, listen to this segment of music and identify a particular aspect of music writing or genius in composition and explain part of it, I couldn't do it. So this was giving me those vibes majorly where she was explaining something about the quality of the music or aspect of the genius. And I just couldn't connect to it. Like I just didn't understand what she was talking about.
That's fair. I mean, I think if you haven't like listened to a lot of this stuff, like it would be hard without having like pulled up, like you're saying, the songs to follow the nuance of some of what she gets into. But I mean, I think she's kind of putting on display like the level to which she is like a savant level fan more than anything else. Like her memory of different like small moments in songs or like she's very good at articulating someone's particular skill set, which I think has really served her as a journalist. Like people might have read one of her more recent profiles this year was on SZA in the New York Times. And she was able, like, I think to capture like these anecdotal like moments, just spending time with her that really people really responded to because it gave you a sense of her as a person. And I think that's kind of what she's trying to do, both in describing these people that are really well known in some cases, like Diana Ross or Aretha Franklin, but then also people who aren't as well known, like trying to give them their due and giving them the same level of attention and care. But again, it does presume a certain, I think, like music literacy or like, have you listened to, I don't know. I mean, I grew up with like the oldies station playing in my house all the time and in my parents' car. So like that helped. And I just listened to music all the time. So, but if you're not like that and you don't listen to this kind of music, like it might be hard to kind of know what she's talking about.
She makes this argument that the Dixie Cups had a very specific way that they pronounce their G's in going to the chapel. So I said, okay, I want to listen, right? I want to understand what she's talking about. And I know that I never would have picked that up without her pointing that out. That just isn't something that I would have observed. I think something that was helping me kind of braid this together is I've been to the Motown Museum in Detroit, and they talk about the ways that the house was specifically rigged and constructed, and they built things within the house so that people could hear themselves specific ways. And I think part of what makes this book distinctive and really is her love letter, like her love dialogue with a particular, like brand of music, like a particular, or like all of pop music really performed by Black women. She's not trying to give you a history of Motown. She's not trying to give you a history of disco. She's not trying to get you to understand like the world of pop and hip hop that Mariah Carey came out of. It's like, this is about these specific women that she admires and her own story evolving along the way. And there's so much about her personal biography that kind of fits into there. Like, you learn that she read Highlights magazine. You learn that she's related to Betty Sorkin, who was the oldest park ranger when this book came out. There's like all these little things. And to your point, she's very much like a micro analyst, right?
Yeah.
Like she's zooming in on the G's. And I think if you already have that background and that lay of the land of like, from Motown, then came this movement, or, you know, the larger cultural significance of The Wiz. I've only ever seen half of The Wiz. So you kind of have to know, you know, like that to appreciate what she's talking about.
And I think she's very good at kind of saying, like, there are challenges that Black women have to face that other people don't. And that she kind of, without shows rather than tells, like, she has navigated personal challenges, family challenges, professional challenges that have made getting to where she is much harder than it would have been for other people. And that these musicians have also had to deal with that, like family abuse. Like she was abused by her mother's boyfriend, like physically he slaps her in the schoolyard in one like very harrowing scene. And he's constantly just like putting her down and like limiting her options. And she ends up having to stay out of home as much as she can to not be around him. So then I think that really resonates when she's talking about like Tina Turner. And obviously like the known narrative about Tina Turner is how much abuse she had to weather to, you know, sustain her career in music, and then how hard it was to come back. And I think she kind of draws these interesting parallels with Black women in the music business, like Noreen Woods, who might be the only Black woman in the room and has ideas about how to reflect Black culture or what musicians to push forward, or, you know, and is not listened to or is listened to, but then the history of the decision erases her from it. And it becomes the story of like men making choices, like the Aretha Franklin induction ceremony at the Hall of Fame. Famously, she did not show up. She was the first woman inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And at the time claimed it was because she had a fear of flying, and she knew months in advance she was going to be inducted. So she kind of makes, you know, Danielle's like, she could have like driven, but whatever. And it ends up all these men get up to like celebrate her, and they keep misusing pronouns. And instead of saying she and like her accolades, say we, and it becomes a celebration of them. And even in that, like Noreen is erased, and how she even helped Aretha like in her career. And Aretha's like statement that she sent ahead only acknowledged male executives who were white mostly. So I mean, I think it's an interesting parallel where then later when Danielle's like working her way up in magazines and newspapers, she's the only Black woman in the room who's like, we should cover rap, like we should cover hip hop. And people in the room were like, no, that's a bad idea. Next. And then she ends up like doubting herself. So I think like in those moments, it does really work to kind of have her story and then these kind of like professional stories.
She also does a good job, and I think a lot of documentaries that we've appreciated in recent years do this. She talks about a quote that may or may not have been said by Elvis, right? Essentially that he doesn't actually care about Black people, but he cares that they buy things that he makes and shine his shoes, right? And it's more crass than that, but she talks about this. And instead of saying, you know, it doesn't matter whether he says it or not, it matters that people believed it. She kind of pulls out of this quote and says, when whites, due to their status and regardless of class, get the cultural credit and actual money, it's a nuclear attack on Black wealth and creativity and the definition of privilege. That's why no one can forget the unverified Elvis quote. And truly, it's not the only one of its kind attributed to Elvis. It reads American. And even if it was never said by him, Presley benefited so much from Black artists who got nothing in return that it is his quote, whether he said it or not. It's his legacy. So I think she does a very good job of kind of getting you out of like, did he or didn't he, and pulls you to the larger picture, right? Like of the benefits that he accrued, whether he actually said that one crass thing or not.
Right. And I think she's good at like even taking Sister Rosetta, who is the person from whom Elvis likely cribbed like a lot of songs and stylings and phrasings in his singing and all kinds of stuff. And you can think like Sister Rosetta has not been celebrated remotely as much as Elvis, but she quotes at one point, she writes, Chuck Berry, who himself is robbed of his full rock legacy, not getting into that, Chuck Berry sucks. One said his entire career was one long Sister Rosetta Tharpe impersonation. The Beach Boys and the Beatles in turn impersonated Berry's mirror of Tharpe to the degree that he sued them for plagiarism and won. Sister Rosetta Tharpe is the first guitar heroine of rock and roll, says the nominee video of the Rock Hall. And this is in a section when she notes Chuck Berry was part of the first class inducted into the Hall of Fame in the 80s when it was founded. And Sister Rosetta Tharpe was not inducted until 2018. So it's kind of like, you know, Black women are not only erased or like appropriated by men like Elvis, but also like Chuck Berry, like within Black music. So it's interesting that she kind of like does, it's not really about like convicting any one white artist, but sort of saying like structurally this is a thing that's allowed to happen time and again, and it's important just to kind of call it out. Like one of the final chapters is about Janet Jackson, and she makes a similar comparison where she profiled her in Vibe magazine, I think in like 1994 or something like that. And she's kind of like, hey, is it true you hate Madonna? Like, not that, doesn't come in that hot, but kind of comes in hot. And is like, is it true you don't like Madonna? And Janet Jackson's like, hate's a strong word. And she's like, I never used the word hate when I asked her this. But she kind of says like, you know, Madonna is allowed to appropriate from, you know, Black culture, Latin culture, Indian culture, every culture that she's interested in, and could like brand that as her self-invention. Appropriation becomes self-invention for her, and for Janet it's something that she gets criticized for. And you know, I think it's more just like kind of asking these questions or like putting these juxtapositions in the book, and then it's like you can kind of think about that.
One of the things that I learned from that I really never knew about at all is what she calls the Drinkard's legacy, right? And she talks about how like when a lot of people look at lineages in pop music, it is like with men at the center. She says Frank Sinatra and his children, Julio Iglesias and Enrique Iglesias, Nat King Cole and his daughter Natalie. All of these systems have males at the center. The discourse spinning around the Drinkards is mostly about fun facts. Did you know Whitney Houston was related to that opera singer Leotine and Diane Warwick? Wow, when in fact they exploded racist and sexual cultural norms and tilted the world. In the Drinkard legacy, last is first. Whitney is the son. And they talk about how like this kind of like random assemblage of trivia around Whitney Houston and the fact that she's related to particularly important Black women in opera and this like whole network of other women. I never knew that. That was super interesting to me. I had no sense of kind of where she came from. And I think that's also why she starts us with Phyllis Wheatley Peters to say, right, like, of course you don't know this. Of course you don't connect these things because you're taught about this poet named Phyllis as a kind of distraction or sideshow for white people in the 18th century in Massachusetts. And you're not taught about this as kind of like starting a particular sort of legacy. And you might know that Whitney Houston had other famous women in her family who are singers, but you're not going to be taught about how people in her lineage were part of like changing opera norms.
Yeah, Leotine Price. Yeah, that was really interesting. I didn't know that they were related. I only knew of her, and this is sort of embarrassing, but not. Remember when Oprah did her Legends Ball?
I do not remember that, but I'm sure Stedman was very excited.
Well, I don't even know if Stedman was allowed to attend, but like this was
fair.
moment. I need to look up when this happened. Hold on. Legends Ball. This was like a time in my life. Legends Ball, 2006. Okay, so Oprah decided kind of from nowhere that she was going to throw this ball at one of her estates where she would have like Black women of a certain age who were pioneers in different areas of life, and then like younger Black women who could potentially look up to them or be mentored by them, and kind of just like bring them together in the same space and have the younger women say like thank you or whatever to these pioneers. So Leontine Price is there. And that's when I first became aware of her. And basically like there's this moment that's described in Mariah Carey's autobiography where Leontine Price writes her a letter and is like, I just want you to know I think you're really talented, and like don't let anybody keep you down. And I guess they had met at this ball, and like Mariah Carey literally, there's a clip of her on YouTube you can find where Oprah just reminds her of this, interviewing her about the of her autobiography, and Mariah Carey starts crying because she's like, it meant so much to me that like this pillar of like Black opera like said this about me. But it's kind of like now knowing that she's related to Whitney Houston, it's interesting that the person that she identified with was Mariah Carey, when obviously they had like kind of a feud. But what did you think about the Whitney Houston section of the book?
I think what was telling to me is that there's like a cluster of people who are grouped together, and then it's like, but then these other people, right, including Whitney Houston, are like the pinnacle of stardom. And I found that part really challenging to read, just to be honest with you, because I think it really took us back to a time where like it was so obvious, like it didn't have to be in retrospect. It was so obvious that Whitney Houston was struggling with so many things and wasn't getting proper support. And I think what was really painful to read in that section was that this really respected musical journalist is sitting down with someone who is really dealing with a lot of different issues, including substance abuse disorder, and the way that, you know, like the difficulty of her life situation and her marriage to Bobby Brown, you know, it really brought me back. We've talked about this before with Britney Spears and other people. Like, she was such a punchline for so long, right? Like, I think she really was just like the butt of so many jokes. And the way that, you know, you see that old footage of pop stars and different people sitting down with folks like Diane Sawyer, and the kind of jabs about people being too skinny but never actually providing help. I found that really difficult. And this is where I sometimes like really had to kind of wrestle with this book, because it's a celebration of these women, but it's also kind of unflinching about certain things, right? Like, it's giving them their credit, but it's not putting them on a pedestal. And that's really unusual. And I think that's where I had some cognitive dissonance in reading it, because that's not typically what you do, right? Like, even the Elvis movie put Elvis on a pedestal while showing problems, and a lot of problems, but, you know, like thinking about that era and thinking about like the talent that she had and like the person that we've lost. I found the Janet section easier to read because, you know, I like know a little bit about her story, and that was like a bit easier to digest. But yeah, just like really hard. I don't know.
Yeah, I thought the Whitney section was really difficult. And in a sense, I think that's the most emotional section of the book for her, because I think it reads like she has a lot of anger that society like pushed Whitney to like find solace or like have the issues that she had with no support. And I think what the most interesting criticism she has in the book, or like the woman in the book who's both profiled and lauded but criticized the most, is Cissy Houston, her mom, because there's a section of it where she says, I mean, it's not explicitly dealt with. She does make mention of Whitney's girlfriend, who now has written a memoir, which I have not read, but who was her assistant, and she's talked about in that way in the book. But Cissy Houston was asked on Oprah, if you had a child who told you they were gay, would you be upset? And she was like, yeah, I wouldn't allow it. Like, and that was her view for all of her life. And I think what's implied there is that like Cissy Houston was so conservative and had such a vision of like what kind of woman and singer Whitney Houston should be, that she both like made Whitney Houston and trained her as a singer and as part of this whole family network. But then also like probably behind the scenes put a lot of pressure on her to like be a certain way. And I feel like it's implied like Danyel is upset about what that meant for Whitney and like how she dealt with that. And like the pressure society puts on her and all these things. Like it was a very like, I think the most primal chapter, like being with her in that hotel where you see like Whitney and Bobby come in and there's this like altercation, and clearly it seems like they're on some kind of substance, and there's just a sadness to like witnessing that, and this feeling of like it didn't have to be that way, and it's really sad. Whereas like the Janet chapter was interesting because I went and read the Vibe profile that she talks about in that chapter, and she actually, I think, like self-edits or misremembers how she engaged the body stuff, or the way people talked about Janet Jackson and her weight and continue to, because the intro to the Vibe piece in the 90s basically is like, everyone is saying Janet's fat now, but the person I saw was really thin when I got to interview her, which itself is like engaging and not great body politics. And in the book, she writes about it as like, it was terrible that people were so obsessed with her body, and like she felt pressured to like lose weight in this period. And it's like, but you were contributing to that. Like you were calling it out, but you were also like, oh no, she's not fat, she's thin. It's like you were participating in that, even if now you regret it or you don't see it that way. And I kind of thought it would have added depth to it if she was like, I was part of this group that put pressure on these women at times to be things and do things that weren't healthy for them. Like I thought that would have been interesting.
To your point, critics are not just reporting, they are tastemakers, right? They're telling us to some degree, right, how to perceive these different artists. The part that stood out to me that I thought was honestly one of the strongest parts of the entire book that will really stick with me, she recalls talking to Janet Jackson and trying to get her to offer a kind of genealogy of her talent, right? So obviously you're part of this powerhouse family. This is the end of the chapter on Janet Jackson, which I think could have been longer. And she's trying to push her to cite influences and to cite a particular kind of listing of other artists. And she talks about how there's influence from her family and Tower of Power. And Danielle writes, that can't be all. She grew up, after all, around Motown. And Janet clarifies, I loved them all, very like Jackson answer. From where, Janet, did you pull control in Rhythm Nation? Who are you? There were many people I loved, but there was a major influence, someone that I studied, ? Janet Jackson answers her own question. No. And I thought that was one of the more interesting interview snippets of the book. The idea that even this person that cares a lot about pulling out the specificities of a talent or a genius can sit with Janet Jackson and say, but who are the people who made up the style that you have or the context for which you did this? And Janet pushing back and saying no, I'm it, I'm the genius. It came out of me and that's it.
Right. And it's interesting because she does seem to get it on one hand, because I think in that same conversation, she's like, your brother is a genius, legend for all time. But right now you are the Jackson, you have surpassed him. And basically, what do we do with that? And it's interesting that with Janet, she wants to both write about how they're often spoken of together, but she's fueling that comparison when Janet's very clearly there is no comparison. I'm my own person. I have no influences. I'm me. I'm a genius. Not I'm a genius, but I did this. Control is inspired by my life. Nasty is inspired by guys I saw at the club. You know what I mean?
That's why I was so surprised, right? I think it is, for this book to have come out last year, and to end with Mariah Carey, who to me, really is a very high profile pop star, of now, but really of a decade plus ago. And then to talk about Formation and Lemonade and to say and that was very important. And Beyonce obviously has these major contributions, but to say but we can't include that in this book. I was what?
Why are we
stopping?
I bumped on that too, and my only guess is that it's a generational difference. I think she sees herself maybe even older than Mariah, so I think she's way more comfortable being Whitney is my age group. And I also think I wondered if there was something to that, the fact that her husband works as an executive at Tidal and is very tight with Jay-Z. And she writes elsewhere about being in Paris with him at Glastonbury, or being in Paris with him and seeing him perform and being part of this entourage that was trying to keep him safe when he had all these death threats, and the same at Glastonbury. So I almost wonder if it's and she thanks both of them explicitly in the acknowledgement. So I'm is it too close to her life? I don't know.
Maybe she doesn't have the comparable material that she would want to pull from, right, to make the chapter mesh with other things. She talks about kind of the high note that she pulls out for Beyonce is her performance at Coachella, right? That this is an especially important moment of validation for Black women as pop stars. And she writes, Beyonce's Coachella entrance occurred 10 years after Jay-Z was treated with such disrespect. She's talking about an earlier incident. Beyonce's Coachella set occurred 3 years after Sandra Bland was found hanging in a Texas jail cell after an unnecessary traffic stop. And then she weaves, this performance into other important moments in recent U.S. history, the murder of George Floyd. And she says, Beyonce reminded everybody in perfect pitch and in vivid historically Black costume to march on until victory is won. It was why only give part of a profile, right? I think we can come up with reasons why, but it does seem there is something different and specific about, Beyonce knows Carter that is worth actually meditating upon. And I feel like the Mariah Carey chapter was so short. Like, we didn't actually really get a ton. Maybe she wants Mariah to keep selling her own books.
Maybe like Mariah was like, you may say this and nothing else about me. I do think, I wonder, she said in one point in the book that it was a mistake to have a personal relationship with any of her subjects. Like when she was a reporter, that she used to think it would be fun to like be friends with them, and then they would expect, perfect coverage, and it would compromise her as a journalist, and she's tried to keep a distance. I almost wonder if, so it might be that, but I also think it's more practical. I think this book took her like 10 years to do, because she kept playing with the format, as we've talked about. Like, it was supposed to be a straight up like book of essays or history, and then her editor, it switched publishers, and the new publisher was like, no, like do this hybrid thing. And I'm wondering if the timeline just got to a point where they were like, we need to publish this book, so like your intended part 4 on like Beyonce says women of today, like that is not going to happen. So like, who knows, maybe she'll publish it as articles, who knows. But yeah, it's really weird in a book on Black women in pop to not have a chapter on Beyonce. Like, that's strange. I mean, in some ways Beyonce just figures as like a passing reference when she was in Destiny's Child, like in a chapter about Mariah Carey. So it's just, it did feel a bit odd.
I would love, I'm sure she's probably done some brilliant writing about this, but the way that she chooses to end the book and to kind of loop back to like Phyllis as archetype. Mm-hmm. And she describes, I'm sure this book, like the timing was just off. She describes how like for her, like the pen is her instrument, right? Like that she is also musical, but that the pen is her instrument and her flute and this and that. And I was like, oh gosh, I bet she was, like shaking her fist when the Lizzo performance of the historic flute from the Library of Congress happened, because that just like ties this whole thing together, right? Of like actually physically playing with history and having this opportunity to do something like that. So I think, to your point, appreciating that she has had this like fascinating point of view on Black women in music because of her position of having to claim the ability to like do this kind of writing, and knowing that she's come out with her own publications. There's also that thing of, if you like a drier style, I guess, or, a certain kind of narrative, this is not a straight narrative of Black women in pop or Black women at the center of pop. There's points, for example, where, she's talking about experiences she had in high school, and then like several chapters later, we get a history of her high school. I was like, wait, where are we going? So like she chooses to not be linear because she chooses to talk about things in a certain kind of topical way. And a lot of this overlaps. It's not like Whitney Houston can really fully be separated from her ancestors. So I think that's part of why it's written a certain way.
Yeah. It feels kind of like meditative or conversational. And I think that makes more sense than, it's definitely not linear. And I think that works for some parts of it, but like some of the artists probably could have benefited with some more background or that kind of thing. I think if people are interested, a similar kind of project or something that's taken on that kind of role is like the whole Versus phenomena that started during COVID of like pairing two similar artists and inviting them to come together and either like literally just play back some of their old music, kind of at each other, or like perform it. And there's one with Dionne Warwick and Gladys Knight, and it's amazing. So we can post that one, but it's like just interesting to kind of see the moments where people are trying to recognize artists who didn't maybe get the due that they deserved in their day.
Can also tell that this was written before Dionne Warwick became like a superstar on Twitter.
Yeah.
Because she's become this very interesting voice on Twitter for the past few years. And people have questioned, like, is this actually you? And it is her and a member of her family who actually run that Twitter account. And she's taken on this very like high profile character as a certain kind of like guidance on Twitter, or like kind of like the way that she reacts to other people's behavior is super interesting. And there's the famous like kind of summit, right, where certain stars were brought to her house to kind of get a scolding for their use of certain language. And it just kind of reminds you, right, like there is this whole internal world of the music industry of which this author has been a part. She's had this kind of up close seat through her family owning a record store and like getting to write her first piece like many decades ago. So I think particularly as we get into the melody, 1964, it's like this is a great way to enter into that story, to kind of think about like what maybe American Girl was trying to do with setting a character in Detroit in 1964, like a black girl who wants to sing. Like, why would they do that? Why is that like this particularly important American story? These definitely speak to each other really well.
Yeah, I think so. And I wonder if Melody would grow up to one day tweet to thank a stranger who found their fanny pack in Marshall's, as Diana Ross did a few years ago. It's one of my favorite all-time tweets.
I think she would, actually. I think Melody would be great on Twitter. She'd maybe like rage quit and protest, which many people have wisely done, but I think like Dionne Warwick has decided she's sticking it out. She has her own reasons. No, she doesn't.
Her tweets make me laugh so hard sometimes. I also thought it was fake, but apparently it's real, and it's very funny.
I have to give credit to whoever came up with this complete farcical campaign of Grimace's birthday at McDonald's, because it has riveted me for the past week. It got me to buy a Grimace shake. I have absolutely loved it. Has nothing to do with this, but some social media campaigns just absolutely work. Like, I'm sure there is some genius in an office somewhere who came up with this, who said like, this creature who they're now claiming is a taste bud, that's never been what Grimace is. But anyway,
what?
I mean, like, I know the McDonald land lore, so anyway, but that's all of the same world of The Wiz, if you will. So, wacky times.
It makes me want to go watch The Wiz. Like, I don't think I've ever seen it. And that's like the one thing in this book that I was like, wow, I've not seen that, so I can't really follow this. But I'm embarrassed I haven't seen it. I'm like, is it good? I don't know.
I will plead the fifth on that, but I think it's worth watching, like, to understand. Okay. I also barely like The Wizard of Oz, so I can own that.
Wow, okay. Got it. Fair enough.
Like, if you want to, like, hang around with a bunch of confused men, like, that's, like, there's just so many other ways to do that at this point. That's what you think it's about.
Yeah, like, fair enough. Yeah, I mean,
love Judy Garland. I'm very happy for her. But, yes.
Yeah, that's fair. I saw the sequel to Wizard of Oz a couple years ago. Like, a friend from work showed it to us, and it was, like, I still don't know what I watched. Have you seen that? I forget what it's called, but like,
I have
it's
not.
Crazy.
I know the Wicked story. I know, different iterations, but, this author makes a good case for understanding, like, on a cultural level, like, why The Wiz was such a big deal. So I will totally go with her there.
Okay, fair. Well, if you have seen The Wiz, you can report back to us. Tell us your thoughts. Tell me if I should go watch it immediately. And, we're looking forward to getting into Melody and her world.
We're also very much looking forward to covering Barbie. And so we are in anticipation of the Barbie movie by Greta Gerwig. We are going to be reading a book that will give you some background. Barbie and Ruth, the story of the world's most famous doll and the woman who created her, by Robin Gerber. So you will want to grab all of your miniature Barbie friends. I don't know if you have your Barbie still.
Me? Yeah. I do have a 1996 gymnast Barbie somewhere at my parents' house. Is it where my American Girl dolls are? I don't know. Like, I'll look. I'll start the search now.
I have already made an assemblage of my favorite Barbies in anticipation of this.
I also owned the Rosie O'Donnell Barbie. Remember that from her talk show?
I don't remember that. That was... I did have the Jasmine Barbie.
My grandma bought me that. Oh, okay.
So I sadly left a hair tie in my Jasmine Barbie's hair, and I learned that hair tie disintegrated into her hair. So I was doing some frantic brushing because I will not have her presented to the world in a subpar condition. But yeah, I still have too many Barbies for someone who does not play with them. But they're available. Fair. That's where we're heading next. So
we're excited to get into Barbie, and I'm really excited to see that movie. So lots of good stuff coming up. And if you have ideas for future Patreon episodes, please write to us, contact us, and you can also visit our Discord channel where we collect future Patreon ideas. All right, thanks everyone. We'll see you on the next episode.